This week on the Jerusalem Post podcast, Professor Efraim Inbar, head of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, joins the podcast to discuss the recent overwhelming protests that we've seen in major cities across Turkey with the arrest of Erdogan's rival and the mayor of Istanbul, and to give our listeners an insight into this great neighbor of ours, history with the Jews, and what we can expect moving forward. This is the Jerusalem Post podcast. I'm Sarah Ben-Nun, night editor at the Jerusalem Post, and I'm joined here today by our podcast producer
Well, and former news
and
personality.
so many other hats. Welcome to the podcast, Ruben.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm so excited to have you here. So excited. Ruben has been a journalist for years and years. You've been around the block.
Yeah, I feel like most people who end up working in the news are somewhat of news aficionados at some point in their lives. So
That's so interesting. I think I didn't care so much about the news until I really started working. Like I was like attentive. I paid attention, but not. It doesn't always go like that. That's interesting.
I think maybe my I can probably trace it back to my childhood because I grew up in a household with two journalists. So coincidentally, here's maybe the nice plug for one of the things we've done this week, where our news editor Alex Winston had a talk with Corinne Baum, who's
Corinne Baum is one of our news desk members, managers.
Breaking news
editor. She's awesome. They're both really awesome, and they spoke about Putin, right?
Exactly. So my dad keeps telling the story that when I was 3 years old in the crib, I was so up over my head, involved with what he and my mom were doing, that there was this one point that he tells that he came back home and I was jumping from my crib saying, Dad, did you hear that Yeltsin is sick?
Oh my God.
Yeah, so I think you can probably
oh my God.
You can trace I think you can trace my roots at least 30 years back.
I'm just trying to imagine little baby Reuven. Wow. There was no other way. This was the only way then for you. All right. Well, we're so happy to have you, and I've worked with you a lot behind the scenes, so it's awesome to see you on this side. This week was a lot. This week was rough.
It was.
It really was. Every day was just something else.
I mean, I think we don't really even know, what do we even plug as number one thing to even say was the top.
The biggest thing.
Yeah.
I think the sensible thing for me is always another day that there are hostages in Gaza. Hamas is still holding 59 hostages. Earlier this week, Hamas released a video, which again, you got to take with a grain of salt. We don't know ever when exactly they're filmed. We have no idea where they're filmed, and we know that the films are edited for content. But Hamas did release two signs of life from two hostages, Yosef Chaim Ohana and
Elkanah
Buchbut. I think today, actually, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with Elkanah's mother. Yep. But we can't separate that. That is always a painful thing on its own, and sadly has become, not so abnormal. But we can't miss the context in which this is happening, right? The kind of collapse of the talks or revival, or it's kind of even no one actually knows what's going on that realm of anything, and intense internal strife over here.
Yeah, I think to me there's a very weird predicament that we're seeing maybe in people's existence. You see two different realities, two different mindsets. There's one that wants to maintain the hostages in Gaza always in the discourse and keep that topic always at the top of the priorities.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you see people just back in their daily routines, just going to shows, stand-up shows, going to the beach, parties.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, this dissonance, I have no idea how people are able to make that jump between the two. It's really it's
Yeah,
puzzling.
it is. It is. I think also it's um at the end of the day, like, we're creatures of habit.
Mm.
And that's the way that I kind of explain it, because it's not everyone, and unless you're really, really, really close to the hostage issue, and I would certainly hope that every Israeli wakes up and prays in whatever way that they pray, or does some sort of action to bring the hostages home. But at the end of the day, we're creatures of habit, right? We need sleep. We wake up, and I was recently having a discussion with a friend about this. She was debating going to salsa, which Ruben is a phenomenal salsa dancer.
Supposedly.
Supposedly, allegedly. So me and this friend were both still kind of in the earlier throes of it. We're still learning. And there was, like, this was a few weeks ago, there was one night where she was debating going, and that really kind of struck her, that exactly that dissonance you're talking about. She said, how can I put myself in a situation where I am being joyful, or I am, doing something good for myself? Not in like a self-sacrificial kind of way, but in a way that you don't understand how you can be in that kind of environment when we know what the hostages are going through. We hear, we heard, we've known it for so long now. I had that like a long time ago. I remember a friend invited me to a party in Tel Aviv. I live in Jerusalem, and I pretty much never leave the city. So I went out. It was like a birthday party. I went out to there, and I remember getting on the bus, and the bus went through like Kaplan over there,
Mhm.
basically. And there's, hostage posters everywhere, and there were protesters on the street, and there were just people walking, and I really felt that then. And I texted that same friend, actually, and I was like, I don't know how I can do this. Like, I don't know how I can go to a party right now. And I went to the party, and it was a party like any other party,
Right.
and then I went home. But I agree with you. It really, really hits you.
Yeah, I think we've seen protesters expanding their work. I think
Yes,
for them it's
absolutely.
work, or maybe even life now, because with everything that's been happening the past week, with the attempt to fire Shin Bet head Ronen Bar and Attorney
Yeah.
General Gali Barav Miara, I think something has kind of picked up with other parts of the general public. But generally speaking, you see the people there in Kaplan and some people here next to the Knesset and next to the official prime minister's residence, who
Yeah.
have been doing this r- religiously over the past year and a half. And it feels like they've been living a different reality, that now people are
Mm.
sort of like joining in, and it's sort of picking up. I don't know if to say it's
No,
majorly.
I do think it is qualitatively different now. And I've the way that I've kind of like bridged it, or kind of like have been able to put it to words in my head, has been that people are so good at uh, kind of dissociating and triaging different issues, and they say, "Oh, well, what are the common issues that people bring to protest groups? I don't agree with all of your messages." It's either that, or I agree with the message, I don't agree with the tone or the method, I don't think you should be blocking traffic, fill in the blank, et cetera, et cetera. And that, um, necessarily, you'll always get people who disagree with that. So then they will identify somewhat with the protest cause, but not with the whole cause. And I think what happened over the last week, 2 weeks, with, like you mentioned, the attempts to fire Barr and the longstanding kind of dislike towards the attorney general, is that the way I'm seeing it, people are starting to understand that these are not separate issues. And so even if you don't necessarily like the message or the method, there is an overwhelming process that's happening right now, which is to get rid of the checks and balances or lessen their power.
Concentrate power within one
Right,
authority under
right. Well,
one.
like within the Knesset, right? The coalition controls the Knesset. We don't really have that separation of power, and
I mean, given the fact that the executive branch is basically sort of like hinged inside
it's
the
neutered. It
legislative,
fully, yeah.
it's hinged inside the legislative branch. So there is that core issue. Um, and I think now that people might have like kind of seen the potential lengths that they believe this government and the person heading it are trying or attempting to consolidate under one specific singular
Yeah,
entity.
yeah. I mean, I think I was actually talking to our editor in chief. We were kind of discussing this and how part of what like Netanyahu's rule and kind of the Likud messaging is so skilled at is sort of taking other causes, other grievances that sectors in the public have with some of the power institutions, with the courts, with the whatever, like you name it, and kind of taking it under its wing. And sort of presenting this, oh, like we have a common enemy here. And so we're going to push this legislative process and we're going to fix that problem for you.
Mm-hmm.
And how that really doesn't always work out. And people, a lot of the times, don't end up getting what they want. And just because you might think that there are issues with the judicial system, and there are very fair and full arguments that there are, I think what's happening is people are starting to see through the cracks of that facade and to say, wait a minute, but like what's happening here, whatever it is, look what it's doing on the street.
Yeah, ever since.
And so it can't be good. Even if it is right, it can't be good. And to kind of like make that distinction and draw that line. And I think whether you agree with the protests or not, you have to give credit to the fact that they are coming with all of their power, with all their might, and their voice is unmistakable.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen these protests stir up since Sunday, and they've tried to maintain like pretty consistent pressure both on Netanyahu and on the Knesset. That especially yesterday when they passed the budget that is very controversial budget.
This budget, I would like to remind all of us that the budget is supposed to pass by January 1st for the next year. That's just protocol,
Well, we're working with what we got. Sometimes you have to be like a bit more flexible.
We're in the middle of a war. Yeah.
I mean, it's not even 2 months late. So I mean, in terms of like being Israeli, it's like not even Shishim.
Shoni slightly, yeah.
Yep.
For sure.
But I think maybe a good point is like in that sense that what you just pointed out. People like to criticize like democratic mechanisms, and they need to remember as well that there is no perfect mechanism. Every type of democracy has its pros and cons.
Yeah.
And
that democracy is kind of the worst of all the bad options of governance.
Well, right. I mean, I'd be happy to be an autocrat, but I know how much other people would be.
True colors.
Yeah, and I think, well, as of yesterday, these are not the only protests that we've seen. Like last evening, we've found out there were protests somewhere else.
Smooth transition. We'll mention two other in the theme of protests this week. First of all, we would be remiss not to mention a protest by Palestinians in Gaza that was objectively brave and dangerous, and it was basically a pro-peace protest. I think it took place in Beit Lahia, and just your Gazan Palestinians who've suffered a war for the past year and a half, coming and saying, we don't want Hamas, we want peace. I don't know what that actually means, but I do think that's pretty big. And to be brave enough to go on a camera and to have that be publicized, maybe that says something about how weakened Hamas actually is on a governance level, which we know is something that Israel has been really insistent on and really pushing on to get, not just as a military power, but also their governing capabilities. Interesting things to keep an eye on, right?
Yeah, and I think some people are skeptical of these protests. Some people are encouraged by these protests. I think,
and some people see them as irrelevant. They're
right. I think you'll see different views depending on where people stand at. But I've seen people saying that Israel should try and leverage this situation now to try and like wrap things up after the renewed
Mm,
offensive a couple weeks ago. Well, last week actually.
last week.
Last week.
It feels like it was a
It
few weeks
I yeah,
ago.
time is a blur.
Time is a blur. Yeah, no, definitely. And the our guest this week is actually super relevant in terms of protests. I spoke with Professor Efraim Inbar from the Jerusalem Institute for Security and Strategy, who really shed some light on Turkey. And the reason Turkey is interesting with protests is because this week there were thousands in the streets of Istanbul and Ankara as well, because the mayor of Istanbul, whose name I will respectfully not say because I'm going to butcher the I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. He's a rival of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's leader, longtime leader, and he was arrested. And what you saw was thousands and thousands of people in the streets. By today, which is Wednesday, there were around 1,100 people that were arrested. But I think this, he and I drew parallels kind of to, and it's not the same thing, and we're not going to try to say that it's the same thing, but nevertheless, you can draw parallels from one to the other of a conservative leader who's been in power a long time, enacting policies that people, some people at least don't love, and seeing a lot of pushback to it. So,
Yeah, I think it should be a very interesting discussion because if you try to like look at the overarching theme, people like especially after these events in Istanbul, it's been a long time that people have been drawing parallels or trying to draw parallels between Erdogan and Netanyahu
yeah, no, it's
in
definitely
in what they
interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of academia in it,
yeah.
right?
I think people are trying to like draw the parallel that they're both trying to consolidate power to themselves and whatnot.
Listen, I think for some people, it's as simple as this works with my agenda and this makes sense to me. I think if you take a more sophisticated stance with it, you're looking for what can I learn,
Absolutely.
right? What can I glean from that person who's in a parallel but slightly similar situation to here? And obviously, Turkey is super relevant to Israel in a lot of ways, but also because it backs the new Syrian leadership, Ahmed al-Shara. His group was backed by the Turks. So and we have soldiers right now up in the Syrian buffer zone. So that kind of security tightrope is something that we're really walking down.
Yeah, this is something very relevant because it's right in our own neighborhood.
It really is, right, mamash, right in our own backyard. So with that, we'll take it away. Professor Efraim Inbar, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast.
My pleasure.
So over the past week, we saw mass protests that were perhaps expected to someone who knows to look for them, but really kind of broke records in terms of the people that came out. We're talking about Turkey in Istanbul when the political rival of Recep Erdogan was arrested. So take us there and explain kind of what we're looking at right now and the broader Turkish timeline.
We should remember that President Erdogan has been the dominant figure in Turkish politics since the beginning of the century.
It's a long time now.
Yeah, and he's an extremely successful politician. He's very articulate. He is charismatic. He has control over the crowds. It's incredible to see him speak to the crowds during an election campaign or on other occasions. And he gradually turned Turkey into a more authoritarian state. Turkey was never, a full democracy because the army had a certain role there and it engaged in coups. But Erdogan was successful in making his party, the AKP, as a hegemonic party in Turkey, and has won elections one after the another. However, in recent years, we see a decline of the party. In the last municipal elections, the party lost the main cities, Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir.
So it's this change that's sort of coming from the popular place, like kind of up?
Yeah, I think that there is growing reluctance within the Turkish public, particularly the more secular-oriented public, which lives in the cities.
Right.
It's not in the Anatolia, so they are more reluctant to see him rule. They are, of course, more Western. They are more sensitive to the human rights violations of the regime. And I think Erdogan made a mistake.
What was that?
Trying to arrest the opposition leader. This is something that obviously creates opposition, and much of the anti-Erdogan sentiments came out into the streets. So this is basically what happened, and this is what we see. We see indeed a reaction, which is not the first time. In 2013, we had the Gezi Park demonstrations. So here and there, we see opposition to the regime, but this time probably was too much.
It was too much. But we're familiar with, road blocking protests over here as well. I want to ask two questions to follow up on that. The first is, are we seeing the sentiment shift more towards younger people, the more secular anti-regime kind of sentiment? And the second is, in terms of the crackdown, kind of what are we looking at in terms of police, how the police have been treating it, and will can the fire keep going in that sense?
Well, Turkey first is a young country.
It's a young country.
Over 90 million people, but it is one of the few countries similar to Israel. We encourage, it encourages increasing the rate of birth in the country. They want a greater population. They believe it will give the country more strength, which it does.
Mm-hmm.
And so the younger, who many of them migrate to the cities, are of course less conservative and more thinking in not a traditional way, which is the main base of support for Erdogan. The country is engaged in a very aggressive foreign policy, which is being criticized by many Turks. I'm not sure that everybody knows. Turkish military is fighting in Syria, is fighting in Iraq, is fighting in Libya, has presence in Qatar, in Cyprus. They don't fight there, but they have a military presence since the conquest of the island in 1974. So some of the policies are not well viewed. And on top of that, the economic situation is not very good.
I feel like it always comes back to economics, right? Or to quality of living, right? If people can't live comfortably, get food on the table in a secure way, they'll get more angry and they'll start to care more about what the authorities are doing and what the leadership is doing. I want to kind of move a little back and examine Turkey. If Turkey's engaging in all these foreign policy excursions, why? Like, how does it view its role in like the broader regional sense?
First of all, I would like to answer the second part of your previous question, if we see anything unusual on part of the government. And I don't think we see something very unusual. They arrest people. Government reports speak about over 1,100 detainees, including media people. And a certain amount of violence, which is minimal from what I know of the Turkish police. So we don't see any unusual drastic measures on part of the government so far.
So far, okay.
But we don't know what will happen in the future. Now about the self-image of Turkey. Turkey has been an empire, a very successful empire. It ruled the Middle East. It was stopped at the gates of Vienna in the 16th century. Yeah. We shouldn't forget that. Everybody that have seen Othello, Shakespeare's Othello or Verdi's Othello, knows about the struggle between the European powers and the Ottoman Empire, and they have a feeling of grandeur. They definitely feel that their country is entitled to have a leadership position in the world. I remember in the end of the 20th century, I visited a lot Turkey. They were speaking about the next century being the Turkish century.
Wow.
And they have a very active cultural foreign policy. They open cultural centers also here in Israel. And they believe the Turkish language, which is a very difficult language, by the way.
It's beautiful, though.
Well, it depends on your ear.
I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, okay, that's all right.
Yeah.
And it is, it sees itself in imperial terms. We should not forget that Turkey has been an empire, and it is the neo-Ottoman impulses are very strong, and not only among the Islamists, even among the more secular elements of the Turkish society. We see a longing for a global role that once the Ottoman Empire played. This is part of their self-image, and it affects their foreign policy. Mm-hmm. We should also remember that the Turkish state is a NATO member, and it has the second largest army in NATO after the United States. And they are ready to fight, in contrast to some European countries which are good at singing or picnicking or other things. And also there is a certain social resilience there that is not existent in European countries. They are at war. They try to crush a Kurdish insurgency.
Right, for years now.
For years. Yeah. They are fighting for years. And we don't see the four mothers phenomenon, mothers demonstrating against the government to bring their boys home. This is totally absent.
Different cultural tones. Yeah.
And it is belonging in many ways to the Middle East.
Turkey. Right. And we can't forget that.
So it has a political culture that values the use of force. Use of force is not seen as anachronistic as some see it in Europe.
Like many other realists, right, on the playing field. Yeah, for sure.
I agree.
Yeah. So now that we have kind of a little bit, at least, into the role that Turkey envisions for itself, and I'm saying it as a monolith just for the sake of time. I want to kind of roll back to Erdogan, and how did he kind of capitalize on all of those things to rise to power, to maintain it, and sometimes even with a bit of an iron fist?
Erdogan is an Islamist, a Turkish version of the Muslim Brotherhood. But he was cautious, very cautious at the beginning. And he didn't push too much his Islamist values. He did it very gradually, relying on the more traditional Anatolian population.
Okay, can you just explain?
Yeah, Anatolia is basically the land mass of Turkey, that it has a coast on the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
And or the Bosphorus or the Black Sea. Those areas are, particularly the Mediterranean, are obviously more open to Western ideas. You can bring more easily via waters, ideas, trade.
Yeah. No, we have this idea of the coastal openness, right?
Right. And it's also a country that is dependent economically much on tourism. I don't know the exact numbers of tourists today, but a few years ago it was about 16 million tourists came to Turkey a year.
A lot.
It's tremendous, and it's justifiable, Turkey
there's what to see for sure.
It's a lot to see there, and in Minor Asia, Istanbul, a city of tremendous beauty. So I think we can see a similar thing in Israel. The labor went too far in secularization policies, in distancing itself from traditional values, and we see a transition to a more Likud traditional, view of things.
Even though it's just to kind of draw the comparison line, it's not necessarily religious, right? It's just leaning into those traditional values,
right?
Meaning, it's because what does that actually do as a citizen? That makes you feel like there's no religious pressure. I don't need to now act differently, but it can align with my values and it's comfortable. So you're saying Erdogan kind of did that over time.
To give you an example, there was a law in Turkey not to allow women to enter government buildings or universities covering their head with a scarf.
Wow. Is this still
No, it was removed by Erdogan, and it was difficult for me and my wife going into a university because my wife, being religious, covered her hair. So this was against the rules. I didn't do much about it, but we basically violated the law.
Right, and you're confronted with the clashing of those values.
Right. So this type of secularist excesses drew opposition, and Erdogan, I think, was very successful in capitalizing on these feelings that the secularists went too far in imposing their values. They were not tolerant enough. So he became the paragon of tolerance and democracy, in contrast to the secularist Kemalist elite. So this was one way for him to strengthen his regime. Also, he capitalized interestingly on his negotiations with the European Union to access the European Union.
Right, apropos Western secular openness. Yeah.
And he used the Europeans to basically to castrate the military politically. The Europeans demanded no military involvement in politics. So he said, okay, in order to adhere to European norms, we have to distance the military from politics. We should not allow them to think about intervening in politics. And this became popular. And this is how also he attracted some of the liberal.
Yeah, that's separation of powers, basically, right? That's a very, very liberal idea.
Some of my secular friends in Turkey voted for him initially. At the beginning of the century, because they didn't like the involvement of Turkish military. So he is a very sophisticated politician, but maybe he is too much in power, too long. And then he loses some of his good political instincts. And I think, again, if we come back to what's happening now in Turkey, I think he made a mistake. And I think he will be able to, maybe, if he wants to fix it. But
maybe he barked too far up the tree.
Yes, I think so. I think,
Wow.
but we'll have to see.
Well,
Wait and
let's
see.
wait and see. Yeah, no, some of my colleagues and I yesterday were trying, before opening Google, we were trying to scour the office and see who the source for absolute power corrupt absolutely is.
Yeah,
And we
Lord
ended up,
Acton.
yeah, we ended up looking it up because shamefully nobody knew it. We drew some lines to Israel, but I do want to shift the focus to there a little bit. Could you tell us about historically what the relations have been, even before for statehood, Ottoman Empire, Palestine? How did that start? Kind of what was the nature of that relationship, and then to kind of carry us into today?
Basically, as Turks tolerated Jews as well as Christians. We are the religions of truth, believe in monotheistic religions, but second-class citizens. But there was autonomy. This was what's called the millet system in the Ottoman Empire, in which religious communities had internal autonomy. They had their own courts, and so we were part of the Jewish millet, which its center was in Istanbul. And
so wait, how old is the Jewish community there then?
I don't know exactly, but it's an old community which is mixed. The Ottoman Empire opened its doors to the people, the Jews that were expelled from Spain.
Right.
So it's an old community, and maybe there were Jews even before that. I wouldn't be surprised. And afterwards, also Ashkenazi Jews came to Istanbul. They have some old synagogues there. And they were tolerated. Of course, they had to pay taxes. During World War II, they were put into camps because of the semi-alliance between Turkey and Nazi Germany. And interestingly, Turkey, when Israel became independent, was the only Muslim country that recognized de facto Israel. Afterwards, it became also de jure. And there are many oscillations in Turkish-Israeli relations.
Well, I want to note that is an interesting start, a de facto recognition, because it's not like the rest of them did, and in fact, we know what happened after. So what was the play there?
First of all, Turkey was allied with the West because it feared Russia. So it
not for this episode.
So it tried to go along with American preferences. Also, we have to remember that there is not much love between Turks and Arabs. The Turks ruled over Arabs. They despise them. You know, in America, we hear Polish jokes. In Turkey, we hear Arab jokes. And so they were never... Also, we have to realize that after independence, Turkey, Ataturk decided to distance Turkey from the Middle East. He didn't want to be part of the Middle East because he believes Arab Middle East is corrupt, is not democratic, is anti-Western. Mm-hmm. So he oriented himself and the country towards the West. He canceled the Arabic alphabet and adopted a Latin alphabet. Mm-hmm. So Turkey, for many years, looked to the West.
I think also geographically, right? It is, and culturally, and kind of from what you're describing in a lot of other ways as well, this cradle that really nourishes itself from the Middle East and from Europe, and is kind of always oscillating between what do we want today? Wow.
To give you an example of their Western orientation, they insist that each foreign policy ministry in every country should make Turkey part of the European desk, not the Middle East desk.
Interesting. Like to that level.
Yeah, and they insist on that. So they looked toward Europe, and of course, after the end of the Cold War, there was a big systemic change in world order, and they were thrown back into the Middle East. They were thrown back into the Middle East with neighboring countries such as Iran, Syria, which are not very nice countries, which were threatening Turkey. And this is why we see in the 90s a very good relation, a rapprochement between Israel and Turkey.
The enemy of my enemy.
Yes,
as
it's
it were.
realpolitik, and they
Yeah.
play the realpolitik very, very well. And there were excellent relations between the two countries. At that time, there were military exercises. The Syrians at that time supported the PKK, which is a Kurdish rebellion. Iran was an Islamist country when Turkey was secularist. So Israel was the perfect ally. Also, for many Turks, Israel, maybe we exaggerate, controls the United States. They are, to give you one example, in the 70s, after they invaded Cyprus,
Mm-hmm.
and U.S. imposed the arms embargo on Turkey, they sent two Jews, senior members of the Jewish community in Istanbul, to Washington.
Okay.
And instantly they worked with the Israeli embassy to try to remove the embargo.
Wow.
And they worked against the Jewish lobby, which was at that time allied with the Greek lobby. So, you
That
know, they're
sounds
very...
that sounds like a movie. That's wow.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
That's an interesting relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So from when Erdogan rose to power, the relationship with Israel has been interesting and kind of up and down. So what does that look like?
Initially, he continued Turkish foreign policy, even visited Israel, I believe in 2005.
So 20 years ago.
Yeah, and some of the military arrangements continued. But the Palestinians are a soft issue very sensitive issue for the Turks.
Because of the Islamic angle, or
The Islamic angle, but also Jerusalem.
Jerusalem?
Jerusalem is something that is very evocative.
Oh yeah,
For
the powder keg of the region.
So,
yeah.
They have a presence here in Jerusalem, by the way, not a positive presence. The arm of their foreign ministry, Tika, organizes iftar dinners here, and they try to buy property. They also subsidize pilgrims, Muslim pilgrims to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, to Nebi Samuel, to Hebron. So they want this presence, and every time there is a military exchange with the Palestinians, they shout.
They shout. Interesting.
And now, of course, there are great concerns in Israel after their proxy in Syria basically took over the country. And this is a sensitive issue for us also. We don't want to see Turkish soldiers near our borders. As I mentioned, they are ready to fight. And it is something that we have to take into consideration. And we have to deal with Turkey in a cautious way.
Mm-hmm. Well, while holding Turkey in this very sensitive security spot on the one hand, I want to look on not the other side, but of a different angle, which is the trade relations with Turkey, which have been very strong over the years, and maybe a bit rocky since the war, but kind of shift us over there.
There was a government decision in Turkey to stop trade with Israel. But of course, this type of decisions can be circumcised, you know,
Yeah.
and there is a lot of trade continues, with people making a few bucks by being intermediaries, and they send it, for example, to Nablus, but it arrives first to Tel Aviv, and it remains in Tel Aviv.
I want to jump back to Syria for a second. Israel currently has soldiers in the Syrian buffer zone, and Turkey and Syria have a long, bloodied, complicated history where Israel has to play its cards really carefully on that front, right?
Definitely. We have to play our cards carefully everywhere. And in Syria particular, we see a new regime, which its roots are in very extreme Islamic groups, Al-Qaeda, things like that. But they are proxies of Turkey. ISIS was supported by Turkey. People do not realize the gate to come to ISIS was via Turkey. ISIS wounded soldiers were treated in Turkish hospitals.
Wow.
Arms were transferred to ISIS via Turkey. So Turkey had an affair with those groups for many years, serving their Islamic dreams and view. And we don't know how this regime in Syria, the new regime in Syria, will evolve.
So far, it sounds to me like they've done, I don't know what they'll do. They've been around since December, but it looks like they've been very kind of shaking all the right hands with the West, and
even hands of women.
Yeah. No, but really that carries weight, and that whether it's sincere or not, I guess we'll find out soon. But I do think that we need to note the strategic element in putting on a suit and shaking hands with all of Europe, right? And that reminds, now that we're talking about it, reminds me a little bit of how you described Erdogan kind of at the beginning.
They are dependent upon Turkey in many ways. But they are Arabs. Some of them are Syrian patriots.
Right.
And they want probably their country to be reunited. Now Syria is divided among Kurds. It's been since 2011 through a terrible civil war, and it's a divided country with many militias. And the new regime tries to reassure the minorities, particularly the Druze and the Kurds,
right.
That they have no hostile intentions. But of course, as you say, we have no sincerometer. We don't know how sincere, and people in the Middle East are always very suspicious. This is part of our DNA here. So far, he made agreements with the Kurds. He made agreements which are denied, so it's not really clear what if there are agreements with the Druze community. And of course, Turkey, as well as the new regime, don't want an Israeli buffer zone in Syria.
I can hear it.
So there's going to be conflict between us and a new regime, which is backed by Turkey.
Right. So it's not only Syria, but it's Turkey as its backer. So we're kind of going up.
Some of the generals that were close to Erdogan had plans to build an Islamic army to come to the Golan Heights and to invade Israel and to come to Jerusalem. So we should keep this type of information in mind when we deal with Syria and the current, Erdogan regime. There are going to be elections in Turkey in 2028, presidential elections. Probably there will be early elections in order to make sure that Erdogan gets a third chance to be president, because this is one of the conditions for having the ability to run a third time, because the law allows only 2 terms for presidency, so he'll probably call for new elections.
Wait, what does that mean? That he could only serve 2 presidential terms?
Like in America, right.
Like
but
ever?
There are exceptions.
So how has he been in power for 25 years?
He was in power as prime minister for many years. There was no limit on that, like in Israel. And after he changed the political system in Turkey to a presidential system, which gave him more power, it's only a 2-term possibility, with few exceptions. And one of the exceptions is early elections. And he will call for or some extreme or emergency. He can always invent some kind of emergency.
Wow. Do you think there's a chance that he won't win if he calls early elections? Meaning, what we're seeing now, the footage and the photos of the protests kind of blew me away, that that amount of people being so upset. I'm wondering how much momentum that can really carry.
We see a clear decline over the years in the support of the popular vote for the AKP.
Mm-hmm.
He made a coalition this time with a right-wing party, but in our region, much depends who counts the vote. So,
how do you mean?
So far, the elections in Turkey have been relatively honest.
Okay.
But this can change, of course, if Erdogan, is really desperate. But it remains to be seen. So far, there are democratic elections in Turkey.
Yeah.
And his support is in decline. The economy is not good. He may lose.
Who are his political rivals?
Of course, Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the Republican Party. And in Turkey, there is a multi-party system. A lot of parties who are fighting among themselves. Very similar
what
to
does
the
that
Israeli,
look like?
very similar to the Israeli system.
Yeah.
And in the last elections, there was some kind of coalition between the opposition parties, but they lost. It remains to be seen. A good friend of mine, a right-wing politician, I just read that, was in jail, was put in jail. So,
Wow.
It's journalists are in jail, politicians are in jail, generals are in jail. Some of my best friends are in jail.
Wow. Yeah, no, that was how we started with the mayor, right?
Yeah.
How do you arrest a mayor?
And actually, according to their rules, once arrested, you cannot continue to be in your position without trial.
Right.
Without trial. So, it's convenient.
So that's looking ahead to 2028. The elections that are causing all the stir right now, they are municipal elections. Correct?
Yeah, we had national elections, we had municipal elections, and we see, if you take a look at the map of Turkey, we see clearly that the coast, the cities are less inclined to vote for Erdogan, while the inner part of the country, Anatolians, who are more conservative, it's a more rural population, are inclined to vote for Erdogan, who stands for traditional values.
Right. Okay.
Also, there is, we should not forget, a change in the education system. He was successful in establishing many more religious schools. Once, when Turkey was secular, there were very few Imam Khatib religious high schools.
Okay.
Now there are many more, and the larger population, the young people were educated in those schools, which makes them candidates to vote for Erdogan.
That's brilliant, actually.
Yeah, he's a brilliant politician.
Yeah. Wow.
And this is also part of the vision of the Turkey they want.
Right.
They want a Turkey that is open to religious values and to traditional values. They look upon the West as decadent. There are some reasons for that, good reasons for that. And of course, there is a lot of anti-American feelings. Don't forget that
Anti-American.
there is in Turkey an obsession, a psychological problem, what they call the sever problem. During the War of Independence, they fought against Western forces that occupied Turkey. And this is how Kemal Pasha, Ataturk, being a good commander, he eliminated those forces. He won the war. And there are anti-Western feelings in Turkey.
Wow. All right. So we will keep an eye over here on everything happening in our grand, great neighbor to the north and their even closer border neighbor, Syria. And yeah, it really is a cradle, right, between East and West, and with its own unique flavor on things. Dr. Efraim Inbar, thank you so much for joining us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Jerusalem Post podcast. If you like this episode, please subscribe, give it a thumbs up. You can access us wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else. Be well.